Good evening, Chief Superintendent, and it's lovely to have you with us. You tell us a bit about why you chose to be a police officer growing up in Glasgow when your brothers all went into show business and you chose a different path. Give us a bit about your background growing up, school, your choice of the police force, and the rather extraordinary journey you've had through the police force since 1992 when you joined in South Brent and in Camden and the London Olympics and the commander of Hounslow, and now of course the borough commander for Camden and for Islington, in the BCU, the borough commander unit. So give us for 5 or 10 minutes a little bit about your background.
Okay, so can everyone hear me? Because
yes, we can.
Beautiful. So, Rabbi, or should I call you detective? Because you
just call me Shlomo.
Shlomo, you appear to know more about my background than I do. You've been doing some detective work, which is very, very impressive. So, Shlomo, I was. So people ask me that question: why did I become a police officer? And there are a number of reasons. So, first and foremost. My parents are Sikh heritage. Obviously, I'm Sikh as well. And one of the core tenets of Sikhism is service, and that to me, serving the public is just who I am. It's in my DNA. My dad was a teacher, my mum was a social worker, and from them I got that real sense of public service, and from my religion, from my faith, got the sense of helping people through injustice, helping people. Apologies, my wife appears to be singing in the background. I don't think she knows I'm in a conference call. Stand by, let me just mute my wife. You can talk amongst yourselves.
We need to know whether you were speaking to her or shouting at her.
Oh, I was speaking loudly, shall we say? That's our Wednesday evening entertainment. So the other thing was that as a child, I used to watch Doctor Who, and I recollect that one of Doctor Who's first assistants was a police officer. So I'm sitting there in my policeman's uniform watching Doctor Who at the age of 4 or 5, and then fast forward 21 years, and my mum says to me, "Why do you want to be a police officer?" And I say, "Well, Mum, you kind of psychologically damaged me as a child because I was always going to be a police officer." So as you can tell from my Birmingham accent, I was brought up in Glasgow. In fact, my 2 youngest brothers are still in Glasgow. They're both in the media business. My parents are still there. And I go up and down fairly regularly. So we moved to Glasgow. I was born in London, moved to Glasgow when I was about 6, lived there for about 20 years. So I've now been a Londoner for much longer than I was ever in Glasgow. But Glasgow is where my heart is, where my home is.
Tell us a bit about Hutchison Grammar School.
So Hutchison Grammar School is a private school, and I was the first. So actually, a year before I joined Hutchison Grammar School, I went to St. Aloysius. Me and my 2 brothers were the first non-Catholics to go to a Catholic school, and that caused quite a lot of controversy at the time. So my parents fought the administrators of school, saying there's nothing in your constitution that says you have to be Catholic. So that's so it's interesting for me to learn about other religions, and great respect for all world religions, obviously, but I've got a very close affinity to Catholicism because I learned catechism, and I attended mass, and went to morning prayers. I can recite the Lord's Prayer much more easily than I can recite any Sikh prayer. So I have a real affinity to Catholicism and Christianity.
How do the boys treat you?
Sorry?
How do the boys treat you?
So at Hutchison Grammar School, so that was when I was up to about the age of 11, I had short hair. And then I went to India with my parents, and I got inspired by going to the Golden Temple and seeing all these men and women who fought for our religion and lost their lives. So the Mughal tyranny from the sort of 12th century, and I remember coming home thinking, well, they lost their lives fighting for their religion, and I'm in England or Scotland at the time, and I can't be bothered following my religion because I'm just a bit lazy. So at the age of 12, I started wearing a turban. Now I was 5'10", 5'11", built like a stick insect, with a turban, and by then a partial beard. So I was very much the focus for let's say the more exuberant class fellows. So on a daily basis, my turban would get knocked off my head. I would be pushed around, shoved around. So I was actually bullied at school, and that's part of the reason why I have a real interest in youth engagement, and I do a lot of school presentations. I had a tough time at school, but as my parents have always said, I'm sure the parents of people on this call have said, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So it was a tough time at school, and I didn't tell my parents what was happening. They didn't find out till years later, because I did that thing of which what lots of young people do is they don't want to worry their parents or their guardians, so they keep quiet. And it's only until much, much later that my parents ever find out how really difficult it was at school.
And what was it like when you joined the police?
So the police was, well, it was the early 90s. It wasn't quite life on Mars, but it wasn't far off it. With about 4 weeks service, I went to my sergeant. I said, there's a police constable who's dealt with this matter wholly inappropriately. It was a racially aggravated assault, and he tried to use the parlance, square it up. And I couldn't sleep that night. So I went to my sergeant. I said, look, something doesn't feel right here. And I had visions that I was about to be ostracized by my team for speaking out. But actually, I had tremendous support from my team, because this officer was known as being quite lazy and someone that tried to take shortcuts all the time. And the suspect was arrested and charged with racially aggravated ABH, actual bodily harm. So a very serious offence, and with the aggravating factors of being racially motivated. But I'd hear some language, and I would, I'd pick my battles. I couldn't fight every battle, but I'd pick my battles, and I often had, shall I call it, feedback from the BME communities, often being described as a traitor, often being told that I'm only arresting them because, I remember this phrase really well, you're only arresting me because you are Indian and you want to get promoted. Leaving aside the fact that the man was a drink driver, was going to get arrested no matter whether I was Indian or not. So I had a bit of stick from my own community, as well as perhaps sort of the wider white community. Where I was first worked was Hayes, and there was a real right-wing contingent. I gathered some quite grudging respect from the skinheads, because I turned up at a call with a couple of colleagues, and I was clearly the butt of their joke, but I gave as good as I got. And as you could, well, I'm hoping you can tell that I kind of use humor as a way of kind of communicating with people. And I gave as good as I got. And in fact, I had a grudging respect from the skinheads, who essentially would like to see me deported from their country, but equally quite like the fact that I stood up for myself and, like I said, gave as good as I got. But policing the 90s was interesting, challenging. Obviously, the murder of Stephen Lawrence, and I was part of the Lawrence review team, and we started to really look at things like, institutional racism, although I think it's more about subconscious bias, and then really starting to look and see why is it that certain groups of people are disproportionately affected by policing. I have a position or perspective that we're a middle class organisation that over polices the working class, and when the working class is overrepresented by people of colour, then logically you are therefore over policing people of colour. And I say this all the time, that more people from the square mile have stolen money out of my pocket through insider share dealing than they've ever robbed me on the street in Camden High Street. So, but that's kind of where we are. And which kind of catapults us back into sort of 2020 and the whole thing around George Floyd's death, the whole thing around stop and search for young black men, because it is about young black men. If you're a young black man, you're much more likely to be tasered, a stun gun used on you, or stopped and searched, or have a more difficult journey through the criminal justice system. These are all statements of facts. These aren't opinions. These are all borne out by facts. And it's a really difficult place to be, because I look into the eyes of our officers, and there's not a racist bone in any of them. genuinely. And they go out, they're ordinary people doing an extraordinary job. But at the other end of all of that activity, it appears that young black men are being searched more than they should do. And I have no answer. It is what it is. But I just say to my officers, look, be professional, be courteous, be compassionate, be empathetic, do your job, and I will look after the other stuff.
Tell us what you have to do as a borough commander.
So it is mostly dealing with local authority colleagues, community groups. It's politics with a small p. So it's about negotiating, influencing, and trying to get funding from other sources, whether it's from Europe, whether from local government, whether it's from central government. It's about understanding the direction that the Camden and Islington is going in, and it's working with the senior leadership team. So I think you've got Neil and Sue on the line, working with people like them just to make sure we're going the right track and developing the business so we can achieve what we're trying to achieve, which is protect the vulnerable and stop people becoming victims of crime.
What sort of level of communication and interaction do you have with the officers who are under your command? So
I would like to think, I'm sure, hopefully Neil will confirm this, that I'm very visible, and so I will attend all our police stations on a regular basis. In fact, just on Monday, I was trying to cycle up to Kentish Town on a police bike to go and attend parade to talk to officers about Mr. Floyd's death and how we as an organisation might want to respond to, how we as human beings might want to respond to that. Unfortunately, I got on a detour and ended up arresting somebody for drunk and disorderly. So I do try and be active, visible and approachable and available to our officers and staff. So I'll do that. We'll do what's known as a weekly brief, which is a capture of all the really great stuff that officers and staff do in Camden and Islington. And a member of the SLT will always write a foreword for that. It's my turn this week, so I'll be writing the foreword for that. And then we take advantage of technology. So one of the not benefits, but one of the learning from COVID is that people are much more relaxed around using technology. So for today, at midday, talk to all our inspectors and sergeants using Microsoft Teams, which is a version of Zoom.
Sure.
And yesterday I recorded my first Metflix video. So the Met have stolen the phrase Netflix and called it Metflix. And I did a 3-minute video which officers and staff locally can.
So there you are. You see, you've gone into the same profession as your brothers. After all, it took a bit of time, but you got there.
Well, better late than never, as Mum says.
So there was a lot of controversy about the merging of the boroughs, and the closing of the Hampstead police station was a matter that agitated a lot of people in the communities in which we live. Has it worked?
Yes, I would say it's worked. It's down to, it's nothing to do with me and everything to do with Catherine Roper initially, and then some members of the SLT that are still present from when that happened. So I referenced Neil Holyoke, who's on the line. He was very much part of that team that helped deliver it. Dave Korcher, who's a detective superintendent, very much part of that team. Really, really hard work, really hard work. The difficulty for me personally is that I've got to manage 2 sets of relationships. So one with Camden Council, one with Islington Council. So straight away that doubles the meetings I need to be attending, doubles the number of people I need to be speaking to on a regular basis. But I got people that I could trust like Neil, like Sue, who can take up some of that slack. I think it's worked. It is about economies of scale. There was some cost savings made from that, from the selling of some of our estate, and from some funding from government. We're now seeing a really large chunk of new officer coming in. But of course, I would say that it would be for the people on this.
There are micro communities within. I mean, just looking at Camden, we know that there's a vast difference between the north and the south of the borough, and there's probably similar kinds of discrepancies in Islington as well. Can you tell us something about the different kind of policing that is required for the different areas? Let's just take what we're more familiar with, the better off northern part of Camden and the more difficult southern part of Camden. must bring up different sorts of attitudes, different kinds of problems, and as a consequence, different kind of policing.
So so obviously we police, or we try and police without fear or favour. But you're right, we do need to tailor our policing according to who we are trying to police. So every single ward in Camden, every single ward in Islington has 2 dedicated ward officers and a PCSO. So 3 members of police that look after that ward. I've taken the decision to grow some wards, so the southern wards, where we know there's a lot more crime and disorder, so Holborn, Gospel Oak, places like that, will attract more people. My view of policing within the neighbourhoods world is very much about engagement. So whether you are in the, and these are your words, not mine, better off northern half of the BCU versus perhaps the more difficult end of the BCU, it's always about engagement. It's always about being visible, open, approachable, transparent and available, and apologising if we get it wrong. And it's about that constant flow of communication. So
so just let me understand the profile, that you want your officers to adopt. If I could put it in terms of tough stance, tough love, soft love, the different kinds of approaches, which one are you promoting?
So I promote an ethos that an arrest is a measurement of failure. And that means that something's happened, a crime has taken place, and we should have stopped it. So for me, it's about stopping crime happening in the first place. Of course, I'm not going to stop every crime. So once a crime has happened, are we doing our best to investigate that crime, within the constraints of how much money we've got, because every crime costs money to investigate. And more importantly, are we looking after that victim of crime to the best of our ability? So I'm not this, when I hear what Donald Trump says about how to police the streets of the USA, that's a million miles from me. It's not about tough love, tough stance. If I have to make difficult decisions, if I have to put in Section 60s, which is when we can have powers to stop and search people without grounds, it's a really strong power. I'm not afraid to use that as a power if I have to. But really, my policing ethos has always been, police are the people, people are the police.
So how do you deal with the young people in the borough who are peddling drugs, the knife crime, the gangs, the burglaries, the robberies, all that kind of stuff? If you're too soft on them, are you not giving them a bit of slack and leeway? And is it not better to be strong and very robust?
Well, I mean, there are times to be robust, of course there are, but robust only takes you so far. Okay, let's say I decide to be really robust and we're going to throw every single person that commits a crime into prison. Well, first of all, the prisons will fall over. Secondly, they're going to come out unrehabilitated and carry on anyway. And as a person of faith, I always think there is something somewhere within that person that I might be able to save. Now, that might be me being slightly, I don't know, naive, but that's my position, is that people aren't born criminals. They make life choices, whether it's their fault or somebody's fault. They make life choices that perhaps lead them to committing crimes. So how do we talk to young people? Well, we talk to young people is what we do. We listen, we understand as best we can. And there are many young people that come through our youth services that go on to be what I'd call successful contributing adults. So, and that's through our partnership work with London Borough Camden. So they've got apprenticeship schemes and job share schemes and all these schemes to get young people there. Those that don't want to engage, then we will arrest if we have to. Burglaries and robberies, close to my heart. No one should have to put up with a stranger entering the house and taking their personal possessions. So I will be robust around finding burglars and jailing them. And I will be robust around finding robbers and jailing them. But I have, for children, we've got 14 and 15-year-olds that sell drugs. I have sympathy because they are children who are partaking in an activity they weren't born to do. They find themselves in that scenario, and it's for me and society to understand why that is and can I save them? If I don't think, you know, if I'm policed with a position that I can't save people, then I don't think I'm any good as a police officer.
What has happened during COVID in relation to the level of crime, the sort of stuff that you'd ordinarily be dealing with, you know, the drugs and the knife crime and the burglaries, etc. Has the lockdown and COVID made a substantial impact on those sorts of activities?
Yes, so we've seen overall, we call them total notifiable offences, essentially all crime types in its totality have gone down by about 30–35% or thereabouts. Some have gone down more, some have gone down not quite as much. The only ones that have gone up are domestic abuse calls, marginally gone up actually, and we might think that's understandable because people are locked in, and you know, instances of domestic abuse might naturally go up anyway. And the other crime type that's gone up is antisocial behaviour, so calls to police around kids, or actually it's adults hanging around breaching COVID legislation.
So
those calls have gone up.
Sounds like in society we have found the antidote to lockup. It's called lockdown.
Well, yes, however, just as I talked about, there's a, you know, we can take advantage of what's happened by use of technology. We can start to take advantage of where we know the streets have started to clear, reclaiming the streets through police officers, PCSOs, you know, town centre wardens, you know, parking attendants, start to reclaim those streets for the law-abiding people that just want to get on with their daily work and life and not be bothered by seeing drug dealing or worried by seeing antisocial behaviour.
Can you, we have a great interest to, personal interest, I guess. You know, it's personal in relation to the two people who graffitied our building and other buildings around. Without prejudicing their fair trial, what are you able to tell us about the way in which you tracked them down and found them and arrested them?
Right, well that was, I mean, so I talk about partnership policing throughout this conversation, and this was a real partnership between the Metropolitan Police Service and the Jewish community.
CST.
Through the Community Security Trust,
yeah.
Through people like yourself, through others, and the CST were instrumental in helping us get there. We would have got there, of course, we would have got there, and I'd made it a commitment. And in fact, what I'd said to Jane Topping, who's my detective superintendent in charge of those sorts of issues, I want to be the arresting officer if I can, because I found it. I felt sick in the stomach when I heard what happened. Absolutely sick in the stomach. So I said to Jane, I want to be that arresting officer. It was and is a real priority for us. But the CST were instrumental in getting us to that point very quickly. Now the two people involved disappeared off mainland Britain and into Europe, and we kind of knew where they were, but it became then a real discussion with the CPS around European arrest warrants. So I won't bore you with the detail, but there's certain triggers that have to be reached before you can get a European arrest warrant, and it's going to be a very high level, high threshold. But we pushed and pushed on it. And we were keeping an eye on them. We knew they were going to come back into the country. You know, we had alerts from all the airline companies, all the ports that they could arrive in, whether it's airport or seaport. And they entered the country a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks, maybe slightly more. They were arrested. They're currently on bail because what we have against them is circumstantial. And I don't want to risk taking something to trial and then getting off because the jury don't believe it was them. So we've actually found paint, and we're doing a mechanical fit and testing the chemical makeup of the paint found on the synagogue and the bus stops and other places versus the chemical makeup of the paint tins that we found. I'm very confident we'll get a charge. Very confident.
But if CCTV actually has a photograph of them, you know, painting the walls, doesn't that kind of clinch it?
It's not as simple as that, but I'm not sure we actually have that. And what we have is there's enough to throw into the mix around. Yes, they were there. They might claim that it's not them, that it's mistaken identity. We've got their telephones as well. There's a load of other things that we're looking at. It's not just CCTV. I mean, CCTV isn't the golden, or the silver bullet to solving everything. Of course, it helps, but we still need good old hard evidence.
How much officer time has had to be devoted to apprehending these two people?
Oh, I haven't even counted, but you know what? If I trebled it and we found them, for me, it's still something I'll do. I said to my officers, money's not an option in this one. Money's not. Don't take it as a blocker for solving this crime. I said, you spend what you need to spend to find these people. And in fact, I went on one of the warrant about 3 days afterwards at one of the addresses where we thought they might be. And there were officers there that were being paid overtime to do this. And I was happy they were being paid overtime to do this because this is too important to worry about.
Raj? Why is it so important to you?
Because, look, 1939 to 45 is within the lifetime of my parents. And I see what goes on in certain countries in Europe, and I see how some of the political landscape in Britain has maybe encouraged some people to operate in a way that I can't have a community like the Jewish community that's been through utter trauma within a lifetime ago to have any sense that some of that might return, even if it's graffiti. That's too much. We know anti-Semitism exists, of course we know that, and I've never understood why anti-Semitism exists. I had this conversation with a friend of mine who's watching some documentary. I was trying to understand what is it about the Jewish people that anti-Semites have a problem with, and I can't get my head around it, but I'm not prepared to allow any form of racism. But a form of racism that led to 6 million people dying, that's the ultimate form of racism, and that's not going to happen again, as far as I'm concerned. So I will stop any sort of behaviour that even talks to that narrative.
I'm struggling to understand whether this extraordinary attitude is the result of your faith and whether the person who's occupying your position were not a person of faith, or whether it is simply an expression of that very deep-seated English decency that exists in this country amongst many, many people. Can you help me?
Yeah, well, so there are people in my SLT who are not people of faith who were as disgusted by what happened. So I think it's a human reaction. I think my faith takes me to the place where, how would I feel if someone did that to a Gurdwara or a mosque or a mandir? And I know it happened in Derby a couple of weeks ago, and that was really hurtful. A Gurdwara in Derby was similarly desecrated. And so it hurt me more because I'm a man of faith, and it resonates with me, but I know there are people on my SLT, and there are officers that when they attended, they were aghast at what they saw. I'm by no means unique as a police officer or indeed a human being. There are many, many people that share the same desire to protect our most vulnerable communities, of which, for whatever unknown reason, the Jewish community finds itself in, and I just don't get it.
Thank you so much for that, Raj. I just want to touch on a couple of other points, and just this is really a point of interest over here. You were the police officer on duty when Amy Winehouse died,
Yep.
and it was a big event in Camden. Just very briefly, because there are other things we want to move on to, tell us a bit about that epic moment.
So my personal learning from that is that when your boss says to you, Raj, can you cover my on-call on a Sunday? The answer should be no. So I was covering John Sutherland, a great friend of mine, a great former actually borough commander for Camden. And John needed the day off, and I said, okay, let me cover for it. So I got the phone call, and I thought, I think I was the second or third person in the whole world to know she died. Clearly the ambulance crew and the attending police officers knew. So I came in and worked up a press release and walked out in front of the world's press, and I got a snapshot of what it must be like to be a celebrity. Bank of cameras. By then, dusk had settled, so it was 7, 8, 9 o'clock at night, and it's quite dark. And I stood in front and I read from this script. And at the end of all of it, I thought, you know, I'm not going to read from a script. You know, I'm a parent. You know, that's somebody's child, and I kind of pleaded with the press, give the family some space. You know, there's a shrine where people can leave, and we'll facilitate that where people can leave flowers. I didn't want people to speculate how Amy died, and so I felt a bit like, you know, sitting on the beach like King Canute, trying to stop the tide coming in. My feet got wet because clearly the press were going to run all sorts of stories about Amy's death, and I just thought, her mum, her dad, her friends, her family, they got to hear all of this nonsense. And in the end, her death wasn't drug misuse. It was shock to the system because she started drinking again. But of course, no one knows that story because they prefer the heroin addict, coke addict story that people like to attribute to Amy. You know, and I was a fan of her music. You know, I knew her songs. I kind of, you know, used to see her on TV. And but you know, to me, she's a human being. She's somebody's child, and that was a bit that really.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd say upset me.
Let's switch back to current. So how much effort and time are you guys going to put into breaking up social groups who are not socially distancing? And how many hours are you going to be spent visiting people in their homes to make sure that they're being quarantined after they arrived from abroad? What sort of resources are you going to put into this? And how far are you going to follow the government's guidelines?
So this is where the interview turns into Andrew Neil interviews Raj. So my priority will always be about fighting crime and keeping crime down. Wherever possible, we will discourage groups gathering together. But the reality is that there are many, many, many more people that want to gather than are police officers that can stop them doing it. So there's got to be a reality check around all of that. In terms of visiting people to see if they are following their 14-day quarantine, I will do what is necessary. But if someone rings 999 and says I'm being burgled, they will always get that priority call. If they ring 999 saying my husband is hitting me, they'll get that priority call. The quarantine stuff, if I can do it, of course I'll do it. But it's not a priority for me when I think there are other top things that I, as a police officer, need to deliver for the people on this call.
There was no any attempt at social distancing at the George Floyd protests today in London. Should the police have done anything about that?
No, because frankly speaking, there were tens of thousands of protesters, and they were not even tens and hundreds of police officers. So we got to be pragmatic. We could go in. So let's say we arrest 200 people. We'll have no police officers left, and there'll still be tens of thousands of people who have made no iota of difference. What we can do is we can plead along the margins around persuading people that it's not healthy. But George Floyd's death, I think, has resonated so deeply with some people that they are willing to break the guidelines around COVID to make their point. But of course, there's not been social distancing for quite some time. You look at any beach in Britain, you look at any open space in London, and people have been breaching social distancing, sadly, far too often for my liking. Now, I very strictly follow social distancing. I only leave the house to go to work, because that's an essential journey, or I'll stay at home. I don't go out. We have our food delivered to us, because I think it's important I lead by example, even though no one's actually watching me. Although you can never...
Well, you never know who's watching you.
Well, I was going to say, you can never say...
Even though you don't think they are.
I mean, they may well be... well, I saw an extra tree outside my house. I'm now wondering whether that's a Daily Mail reporter dressed as a tree. So you don't know, but what I do, I try and follow my own lead wherever I can. So, but there's not been social distancing in Britain for quite some time, rather sadly so.
No, there hasn't. Okay, we're going to open this to, for the next 15 minutes, to questions from the large number of people who are participating in the program tonight. If you'd like to, you're going to remain muted, but if you want to ask a question, you can do one or two things. You can either put a question onto chat, and if there's time, I'll read it out. Alternatively, you can unmute yourself either by pressing the space bar on your computer and holding it down while you speak. And once you have let go of the space bar, you'll be muted again, or by unmuting yourself through the little icons. So anybody who would like to start by asking a question, please feel free to do so. I have a question in the chats. Let me see. What happened on Hampstead Heath last night, and who decides how many police are sent to break up a mass brawl of over 100 teenagers?
So what happened last night was there was a call to police, people fighting. We turned up, and lo and behold, there were people fighting of a younger generation, probably teenagers, early 20s. And just because of the sheer numbers, we had officers available anyway, and because of the sheer numbers, we took the decision that part needed to be cleared for all sorts of reasons, but primarily around health and public safety, because there'd clearly been a great deal of drinking going on. And, we didn't know if someone was going to end up in some alcohol coma or alcohol poisoning. There'd been a fight. We didn't know whether weapons were going to be used. We just didn't know what we had. So we very successfully stopped that. There were 6 arrests, I believe. But the question was asked of me earlier on today whether it was related to lockdown. Well, unfortunately, Hampstead Heath attracts this kind of behaviour on an annual basis. It's just, some people call it hijinks. I'm not sure I'd call it that, but then I am a 53-year-old man. So what am I going to call it? But it happens on an annual basis. The park spaces, the hot weather. It has been exacerbated slightly because a lot of these kids aren't at school. So they're out perhaps taking advantage of not being at school. It does leave a dilemma to the parents and guardians who say, we're not sure that they should go to school because is it safe? Yeah, well, was it safe to not know where they were and they're in a park, not socially distancing? So I think there's a real intriguing dilemma for some parents and guardians around whether they'd allow their kids to go to school, in the knowledge that perhaps they've been allowing their kids to get on with stuff that's probably more dangerous than them going to school.
Another question over here is from one of my members, Karen Baru, who is a qualified psychotherapist, and she's asking the question that is there a change in how domestic violence is being handled during COVID?
Very slightly, in as much as a lot of the support we try and give necessarily has to be virtual. I was a bit concerned when you said that a psychotherapist was going to ask me a question, because I thought she was going to ask me, why on earth did you wear that T-shirt, Raj? I just realised I'm wearing a Soul Caliber T-shirt, and I should have worn perhaps something more appropriate. But what we're doing is, we have a really great relationship with our IDVAs, our Independent Domestic Violence officers. They are members of the public who will talk to domestic victims of crime and encourage and persuade them to take the best course for getting out of a scenario, whether that's having somebody arrested or leaving the house or having their partner thrown out. So we very much still rely on the really good work. We had to change some of it. So if we're talking about a particular victim of domestic abuse that we know is coming to notice quite regularly, rather than coming to the same room, we'll have those meetings more virtually. So slightly amended, but the core of what we're doing is that the victim comes first.
A question, if you were, this is a political one, Raj, if you were Home Secretary, and you were well established now in your position, you'd been there for a while, you'd had a chance to have a good look around, poked around, see what's going on, etc. What changes would you make to the police service?
I'd make no changes to the police service. I would give all the money I could to youth engagement services. Charities, youth centres, anything that supports young people in being the best versions of themselves they can be. And by doing that, what we'll do is we'll be able to stretch our ability to support young people much better. I think for understandable reasons, austerity meant cut down in many, many services. but you know, the impact it had on youth services across Britain and mental health services, actually, it'd be remiss of me to say. And these are two things that really drive, you know, criminality and people making unfortunate life choices. I wouldn't give money to the police. I would give it to mental health and youth services.
And that leads in nicely to another question from one of our members who is a criminal law practitioner. And she wants to know if there are any plans to build bridges and have inroads into community discussions between the police, parents, schools and youth in regard to crime, particularly when lockdown comes to an end, in respect of drugs and burglary, etc. In other words, a greater sense of interaction between all of the stakeholders, parents, the kids, the youth, etc.
So actually we kind of do that, but you know what's a really good prompt, because I don't think that we do that enough with the parents. So things like our volunteer police cadets, things like our Safer Schools officers who are embedded in the school, who will take classes, who will chat to young people. Part of our, we have a gangs team that has an engagement side to it, which is about talking to young people. I don't think we talk enough to parents and guardians. This is my second stint in the sort of the Camden area. First time I was around, I launched a Somali mum service, because it seemed to me that Somali mums, that generation, this is going back 10 years, that generation of Somali mum didn't understand English because they'd newly come over into the country and their children were running rings around them. So we, every Saturday or Sunday, I can't remember, in the local school, we had them in and we taught them things around what are their rights, what can they do, what can, and very quickly Somali mums started to understand what their kids might be up to. I do think that we should engage with the parents and guardians more. You know, that's a really good point. I've never really quite thought of it like that. I think I've just generated some homework for myself.
On this point and developing the point, you know, the community that you're talking to now is relatively well educated, by and large, you know, sort of well off in relative terms. What would you like from us in partnership with you folks in policing? And I'm not talking about keeping our eyes open to look out for burglars and to call you when we see them. I'm asking if there's any other form of partnership that we can enter into that will be meaningful in terms of contributing to the well-being of the borough and in resolving some of the very difficult social issues that you have to cope with.
That's a great question, which I've never really thought about. What is the ask from others? I mean, I know enough about the Jewish community to know that how exceptionally generous they are in terms of charity and looking after others ahead of themselves. I mean, I don't know, you know, there may be particular Jewish schools that might be able to open their doors to schools that are perhaps less well off and don't have some of the equipment or the grounds, maybe something like that. The relationship we have with our Jewish community is second to none. So I wouldn't want that to change. A really good question. I don't know. I mean, I think it's more about can you know, if schools are in certain parts of London are lucky enough to have spaces where young people can go play football, hockey, whatever it might be, whether we might be able to open that up to schools that are less well off. I don't know.
All
Could
right,
I ask you a question?
Yes,
First
please.
of all,
Just announce yourself first, please.
First of all, many thanks
Nice.
for sharing your wisdom and your insight and your compassion and your humanity. It's hugely reassuring to have you at the head of the force. Two questions really. How are police officers disciplined who don't have your compassion and who do overstep the mark? And the second part to the question is, what's your view of unofficial courts, for example, unofficial Somali courts, disciplining youth, and are the police turning a blind eye and allowing this to happen because it will be more effective? And what is your view of other cultural injustices such as honor killings, and how does one deal with these things in today's London?
Okay, so the question about compassion, I mean, I like to think that the vast majority of my colleagues are compassionate and sympathetic and empathetic, some more than others, some through the very nature of their work. They build up a shield because it's just too much to take on. We have seen an increase in issues around health and well-being and stress with police officers because of some of the things they're seeing. And I think that's a societal thing anyway. I think society is, first of all, more open to understanding that mental health and stress are real things and should be things to be talked about. But also, I think police officers are seeing things, and that drip effect might take away some of that compassion that they might ordinarily have. If a police officer steps out of line, depending on what he or she's done, we try and approach everything from a learning perspective. And I always think to myself that if an officer's done something wrong, then it's I've failed somewhere because they've done something that I would have hoped they would have taken a lead from and done something different. But let's say they made a mistake. Now look at it about learning. If it's something significant, then I'm afraid I'll invite them to leave the organisation, and I'm strong and clear about that. And there are a number of times when people have asked me about officers that have stepped outside of what I think is their professional area, and I've said that's not for me. Policing is too responsible for us to take a chance with. I don't want to lose the legitimacy of working with the public. The second question around was that around the sort of Somali
Cultural courts.
Yeah, the cultural courts. So we know that we think, so obviously Sharia law, that's a controversial subject that Katie Hopkins and others might think exists. Does it exist? Yes, it exists. Do we turn a blind eye? No, we don't. Do we know where it's happening all the time? We don't know that either. What I would say to any community is that this is England, this is Britain. The rules of law are the same for everybody. You can have some cultural differences around how you might eat and drink and et cetera. When it comes to the law is quite clear. It's here to protect everybody. And if you're in this country, then you must abide by the laws. And our laws are the most reasonable in the world. So I've struggled to find someone that says your laws are unreasonable. In terms of, it's an interesting phrase, honour-based violence, because I had a conversation with somebody else. I'm not sure I like the term honour-based. There's no honour involved in any of this, but I get your point. So we know that female genital mutilation hasn't really quite gone away yet. We know that people who look like me often force their daughters to marry men they don't want to be married to, send them off to India, Pakistan to get married, all this kind of stuff. And we do look at it. These are very, very difficult things to deal with because we need the support of the community, and some communities still don't quite trust the police, or they're so worried about their community being tarnished with a bad brush that they don't say anything. So we know that instances where children are whisked away to get married to adult men, we don't always find out those things. And my plea would be, tell us. It's just not right.
So I just want to ask you one last question because our time is up. You've had pretty much, Raj, of a stellar career in the police force. You're the highest ranking Sikh officer in the Metropolitan Police, which must give an enormous amount of pride to your parents and indeed to the whole of the Sikh community. If there was one job, not from the point of view of ego, but in terms of you being able to fulfill all those things that you feel in your heart, you joined the police in order to do, to create a better, more just society. If there's one position within the police organization that would allow you to do that, what position would it be that you would aspire to?
There is only one position in the police service throughout Britain. That's the commissioner's job. Of course, I would love to have been the commissioner, but if the bookend of my career is retire as the BCU commander for Camden and Islington, that's potentially the greatest gig a man or woman could ever have. But that would be the role, because it's that chance to really influence 35, 40,000 people looking after 10 million people. Cressida has to say, I think the values that Cressida has, I have. The approach to policing Cressida has, I have. I don't think my values necessarily align to the previous commissioner, much as I respected him, but it's not a style of policing that I wanted to have. I wanted to have something more collaborative, and that's why Cressida's leadership style really talks to me. I'd love to have been the commissioner. I mean, it makes me smile when you say that the highest ranking Sikh officer in the Met, because in about half an hour's time, my dad will ring me up. He's 85, and his stock question is, have you applied for promotion yet? So he's still not content, and that's good. And actually, when you say my parents must be proud, my parents are exceptionally proud. And what I do in life, I always think, what will my mum and dad think about what I'm doing? I mean, my mum would have said to me, Raj, why on earth did you choose that T-shirt? But they're my moral compass around what would my parents think. And I think some of that's missing in society. Some of that's missing, where people don't stop and think, what would my gran think about what I'm doing here? What my aunt think of what I'm doing? They just get on with doing what they're doing.
So I want to end with an anecdotal story, Raj. It took place quite a long time ago, but it was one late night when I was had to go to Warman Freed to one of our kiddies was not well. It was well after hours. It was the late show, and I walked into Warman Freed Chemist in Golders Green Road, and there was no one else in the shop at that time of night, and the person behind the counter was a Sikh. I asked for the items that I wanted, and he was looking at me and said to me, do you mind if I ask you a personal question? To which I said, no, please, go ahead. He said, how do you keep your beard rolled up? It led us into a fascinating conversation about clips and sprays and anti-gravity drugs and all kinds of things. And actually, I walked out of the chemist and I thought, that's the first time I've ever engaged in interfaith dialogue with a Sikh. But I want to tell you, tonight was a lot better.
That's a wonderful story. Until about 20 years ago, I used to have my beard uncut, and I think the amount of L'Oreal hairspray I went through every day to keep my beard in one place single-handedly caused a hole in the ozone layer. But there are all sorts of products that Sikh men and brothers from the Jewish community and other communities use to try and look relatively neat and tidy.
Indeed. Well, I've got one final question for you. I want to come back to the man you arrested when you were riding on your bicycle. Yes. When you handcuffed him to your bike, how did you get him back to the station?
Yep.
Got off and wheeled it.
You put him on your bike and you took him back home. Raj, Superintendent.
Well,
pardon?
I had to call a van to collect him and cycle back. Now, can I just say, it's been a real honour to have this conversation amongst the good people of Hampstead and beyond. A very non-demanding members of our community, which worries me slightly because people don't always ask much of me. But always there for policing and society more generally. The Jewish community are always the first to step up if there's an issue. And I see a real kinship between Sikhs and Jews in that respect. And when I went to the synagogue to actually pay my respects and say sorry for what's happened, I felt at home. I really did feel at home.
Well, you will always be at home in our synagogue at any time that you wish to visit. And the reason why we are undemanding is because we're just so thrilled that you are the head honcho in charge of the whole shooting match. And we feel enormously comforted by your attitude, by your humanity that Roberts and Lindy mentioned, and just being there for us. So thank you so much for joining us tonight, and we look forward to further discussions in the future. And
thank you very much.
And I want to take the opportunity, by the way, not just to thank you, but to thank all of your team, all the people who stand alongside you and behind you. And I know that there are a number of them, some who you said would be joining us here tonight, like to thank all of you, not just in the matter of the anti-Semitic graffiti that we suffered as a community, but in supporting us as a Jewish community at all times. We feel absolutely privileged to be living in this country with the kind of support that we get from people like you. It is not something to be taken lightly or for granted. It doesn't happen in the same way in lots and lots of other countries, and it's very special that you are there for us. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. All right. Thank you, Raj. And look forward
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Take care. Have a good evening, everyone. Look after yourselves. Bye.
Thank you so
Thank you
much.
very much.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure.